My name is Vashi Capello. I'm very focused on politics, so that will form part of the discussion with both Professor Bengio and Professor Harari. Welcome to the conversation. It's such a pleasure to have you join us this afternoon. You can hear me.
Thank you, and let me assure you, I'm not a deep fake or an AI.
That is a relief to find out. So I wanted to frame the discussion with both of you moving forward around how you view, at first, right now, we'll get into the potential, positive aspects, but right now the threat as you view AI poses. How would you succinctly describe it for our audience this afternoon, Professor Harari?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are two things to know about AI. It's the first technology in history that can make decisions by itself, and it's the first technology in history that can create ideas by itself. Lots of people are now trying to calm us down by telling us that every time there is a new technology, people are afraid of the consequences, and in the end, we manage okay. But this is nothing like anything we've seen before in history. Whether it's a stone knife or an atom bomb, all previous tools empowered us because it was humans who had to decide how to use the bomb. But AI can make decisions by itself, so it potentially takes power away from us. Secondly, all previous information technology in history, they could only reproduce or spread the ideas of human being. Like the printing press could print the Bible, but it could not write the Bible, or it could not write a commentary on the Bible. ChatGPT can create a completely new commentary on the Bible or on anything else, and it can potentially in the future even create new holy texts for future religions. Humans always fantasized about getting their holy scriptures from a superhuman intelligence. Now it's becoming possible. Now there are many positive usages for this kind of power, but there are also many negative usages. And again, it's fundamentally different from anything we've encountered before because it can take power away from us.
Professor Bengio, how do you view the fundamental threat AI poses at this juncture?
Well, the problem is that there are many threats, but the two most important that I'm concerned with are in the shorter term, and it could be as soon as the next US election, that tools derived from the large language models that we've been talking about can be used for propaganda, for disinformation, for personalized trolls that could convince you to vote otherwise. And the second threat, which may come as soon as a few years from now, maybe a decade from now, it's hard to say, is if we bridge the gap between the current state of the art in AI and the abilities that humans have in terms of intelligence, and we build machines that would be at least as smart as us, but then automatically they would have advantages because of access to all the data, because of digital communication, bandwidth, all kinds of advantages that allow them to acquire information faster than humans, to share it among themselves, all sorts of things that make me think, and others, that even if we only uncover the same kind of principles that give us our own intelligence, they would become smarter than us in some ways. And we already see that with things like ChatGPT, that in some ways they're smarter than us, and they know more things, but they're also more stupid in other ways.
Let me just follow up quickly with you on that. And bottom line, if they are able to be smarter than us, what is the threat that poses? Is it existential?
Yes.
And what do you mean by that? Not to depress everyone here. It's very weighty, but...
Well, there's a lot of unknown, and Jeff Hinton uses this analogy that others have used as well. Imagine we created a new species, and that species was, smarter than us in the same way that we're smarter than mice or frogs or something. Are we treating the frogs well?
A question we ask ourselves all the time. Professor Harari, I want to get you to weigh in on the same because you've written extensively about sort of the threat to democracy and that AI poses and more in the near term. Do you share the concern about the potential longer term threat in that it might be existential in nature?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are short-term threats which are also very significant, like the collapse of democracy.
Oops.
Oh no. It's like
Continues
we're
to
still
develop and becomes more intelligent than us, then I completely agree with the frog analogy. It doesn't bode well for us.
we just you froze for a second there, so we just caught the ending. So we're not here to depress.
I agree
yes.
with the frog analogy. That and another way to think about it is that the AI we
Oh.
Oh no.
being much, much faster than biological evolution. I mean, if the AI of today is like an amoeba, so just imagine what T-Rex would look like, and it won't take billions of years to get there. We could get there in a few years.
Well, actually, I think that's an excellent point to follow up on with you, Professor Bengio, because I feel like as a regular person, not an expert like yourself, this stuff is very scary to hear. And are there timelines in your mind attached to it? And I think I ask that question not to further or amplify those fears, but to bring us to a conversation around how to mitigate those eventualities, right? And how fast must policymakers act in response? So what kinds of timelines are you thinking of?
So the problem is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the timeline. And it could be as little as a few years before we at least have the principles to build machines as intelligent as us and thus smarter than us. Or it could be decades. And because there is such uncertainty, I think we collectively, and our governments in particular, have a responsibility to prepare for the worst case. At least the plausible worst case, which might be like 5 years. I don't know. And what's important, and Yuval talks a lot about that, is the transition. Like how do we make sure that we adapt fast enough? So if it comes in decades, maybe we have a chance to adapt society. If it comes in 5 years, it seems hopeless, right? So what can we do to slow things down where it's more dangerous? How do we start as soon as possible putting the right guardrails to minimize all the risks that we've been talking about today?
Professor Harari, you are both signatories to a letter that essentially asks companies behind the development of this technology, in response to what Professor Bengio just laid out, to take a pause on what they're doing. Why that letter, I think, again, sort of, we were just discussing what brought all this to a higher level of public cognizance. That letter certainly did the trick. Why was it important for you to attach your name to it?
No, because again, it's really an existential risk to humanity. And what we need above all is time. Human societies are extremely adaptable. We are good at it, but it takes time. And if you look, for instance, at the last time that we had a major technological revolution, the Industrial Revolution, it took us many generations to figure out how to build relatively good industrial societies. And on the way, we had some terrible experiments, failed experiments in how to build industrial societies. Nazism and Soviet communism can be seen as simply failed experiments that killed millions and millions of people in how to build functioning industrial societies. And now we are dealing with something even more powerful than the trains and radio and electricity that we invented in the Industrial Revolution. I think there is certainly a way to build good societies with AI, but it will take time, and and we need to make sure that we don't make any more such failed experiments, because if we do it now with this kind of technology, we won't get a second chance. We won't survive it. We managed to survive the failed experiments of the Industrial Revolution only because the technology was not powerful enough to destroy us. So we have to be extremely careful, and we need to take things more slowly.
In facing huge issues like the professor just laid out, Professor Bengio, there's a corporate or societal response, and then there's also a government response. This letter is a little bit aimed at both, but primarily asking the corporations behind this to take a pause. When you signed it, did you think they would?
No.
Thank you for being clear. Why not?
The incentive system we've built in that, as Yuval is saying, works reasonably well for our industrial societies in our liberal democracies, is based on competition. And companies would not survive if they didn't play that game, because another one would take their place. Now, there are also individuals in those companies that may think that, ethics and social values are important. So humans can temper a bit that profit maximization incentive, but it's a very strong one. As far as I'm concerned, I didn't write the letter. I signed it. I thought it was a really good way to call attention to the problem, to the general public, to governments. And even people in companies have been discussing behind closed doors a lot since the letter. So it has worked in that sense, which is, I think the real reason why I signed it.
Did you, Professor Harari, think when you signed it that anybody would take a pause?
Not the companies for the same reasons, but we hoped at least to draw the attention of the public and of the governments, because ultimately it's responsibility of governments to regulate this very dangerous development. Unfortunately, what we saw in recent years is that the political discussion is just not there. If you look at the main political issues that politicians, that parties are talking about, they are not talking about this at all. And this should be one of the top issues in every election campaigns now. Because it's not just the existential dangers down the line. It's also immediate concerns of everyday life. It's our jobs. It's who is making decisions about our life. You apply to a bank to get a loan. Increasingly, it's an AI making the decision about you. You apply to university. You apply to an employer to get a job. Increasingly, it's an AI making the decision. And you can't even understand if they reject you, why they rejected you. And this should be, again, at the top of our political priorities. And at least my hope was that this letter would help push the issue to the center of attention. And I'm glad to see that it, at least to some extent, succeeded.
Do you agree, Professor Bengio, that there is a political malaise around this at this moment?
Yeah. Politicians, for the most part, want to talk about positive things. Actually, I think it's the case also of a lot of AI experts that they want to stick to the good side of AI. But, life is what it really is, and we need to face the dangers, the sooner the better. So I think it's going to take time for politicians to accept that they have a responsibility here, not just to be thinking about the economic benefits or the benefits to healthcare and so on of AI, but also that they have a duty to protect the public from the short-term and long-term risks.
I think, Professor Harari, there's some responsibility for the media to ask politicians that question. There's some culpability in the job I do as well. I think as a result, though, of both the letter and Geoffrey Hinton coming out and saying what he did, it seems, especially south of the border where we are right now in the United States, there did seem to be a heightened awareness among politicians. They held a congressional hearing. And even during that hearing, the man behind OpenAI, Samuel Altman, basically pleaded with the government there, with government representatives, to regulate AI more. How significant do you think that is?
I think it's very significant. And again, we need to do it quickly. And when we talk about regulation, we need to differentiate between regulating the development of AI, the research in laboratories and so forth, and regulating the deployment into the public sphere. And I think it's more urgent and also easier to regulate the deployment. There are some very simple rules that we need to make. For instance, that an AI cannot counterfeit humans. That if you're talking with someone, you need to know whether it's a human or an AI. If we don't do that, then the public conversation collapses and democracy cannot survive. And it's just common sense. The same way for thousands of years, we had laws against counterfeiting money. Otherwise, the financial system would have collapsed. And even though it's quite easy today to counterfeit money, people don't do it because they are afraid they will go to 20 years in jail. We need the same kind of laws about faking humans or counterfeiting humans. And similarly, the same way you cannot release powerful new medicines or vehicles into the public sphere without going through safety checks and getting approval, it should be the same with AI. That, okay, you developed something in your laboratory before you can deploy it to the public sphere with potentially immense consequences for society, it has to go through a similar process of safety checks.
Would you, Professor Bengio, describe the deployment side of things as an unregulated, area right now?
Well, not completely, because we have laws about data, we have laws about communication, but they were not designed to deal with some of the problems we're talking about. So, for example, there's currently nothing, as far as I know, against counterfeiting humans. And it's interesting, this counterfeiting example, because counterfeiting money is, as far as I know, punished very, very severely because the stakes are so high. And I think it's similar. Regarding the regulation for these things, there's a thing that worries me about the way things might be going on in the US. I think that is that we need the regulatory body to have a lot of agility. So here there's a bill in front of Parliament in Canada which has that kind of structure where the law is principles-based. You know, it states like even ethical principles that AI and companies doing it should follow, and it leaves the details, the rules, to a government agency, and that's good because the field is moving too quickly. The nefarious uses that we can think of now, maybe they'll be different in 6 months from now. The science moves, the technology moves, the market moves. And we need a lot of agility from governments, which is not what they're recognized for.
Not their strong suit.
Yeah, I know. But in the US, my understanding is that in the last few years, governments have moved away from these kind of principles-based legislation, where you delegate power to some agency and instead try to have everything written down by Congress because they don't want to give any kind of control to some government agency, I mean, especially the Republicans. And that might be a big obstacle for efficient government intervention.
How would you characterize what could be efficient government intervention, Professor Harari? You've talked a little bit about some simple things they could introduce for deployment. What else?
Yeah, so one other thing that they could introduce low-tech demands, like that if you want to have a social media account, you must go to some office made from stones and sign a piece of paper. Now, it's very inefficient, but the inefficiency is a feature, not a bug. We do it with other things, a passport, a driving license. A passport to social media could also be, you will need to go through this low-tech operation. And this will immediately get rid of almost all the bots on social media. And going back to the problems of the collapse of democracy, I think introducing such a low-tech demand would immediately get rid of most of the bots and help us save democracy. What we should remember is that we are now facing a paradox in countries like the USA, also in my country, in Israel. We have the most sophisticated and powerful information technology in history, and yet people are no longer able to talk with one another. People are no longer able to agree on anything, even about who won the last elections or whether vaccines are good for you or bad for you. So how is it possible that with such powerful information technology, the conversation is collapsing? Something is wrong, deeply wrong, with at least the way we deploy our information technology. And we need to step back and think about it before we deploy even more powerful tools like AI, which could result in the complete collapse of the conversation. Again, if you're having a discussion about the elections with somebody and you can't tell whether it's an AI or a human, that's the end of democracy. Because for a human being, it's pointless to waste time trying to change the mind of a bot. The bot doesn't have a mind. But for the bot, every minute it spends talking with me, it gets to know me better, it builds even intimacy with me, and then it's easier for the bot to change my views. We have known for a couple of years that there is a battle for attention going on in social media. Now, with the new generation of AI, the battlefront is shifting from attention to intimacy. We are likely to be if we don't regulate it, we are likely to be in a situation when you have millions, maybe billions of AI agents trying to gain our intimacy, because that's the easiest way to then convince us to buy a product or vote for a politician or whatever. And if we allow this to happen, it will lead to social collapse.
As Professor Harari is describing that, I was thinking, Professor Bengio, of the debate and the discussion around just the first battle that he describes, social media and its impact on democracy, and the pushback that there is to more government intervention versus the, up against the idea of free speech, and the political debate that occurred just on that. Forget about all the AI that we're talking about and the threat that poses, but just around that, there seems to be, and somewhat understandably, given the pushback, a hesitancy for governments to insert themselves too far into this. How troubling is that, given the prospects that lay ahead?
Well, there's a kind of either vicious circle around democracy itself. So if we had a healthier democracy, we would be in a better position to protect it. And why is it that democracy is so fragile? One of the factors that I think social media and eventually AI might really ride on is that humans are quite easily influenceable, and we're not always rational. We're influenced by, as Yuval was saying, the relationship we have with a person, and if we value that person, we'll kind of buy what they say without really checking if it makes sense. And demagogy has existed for thousands of years, as much as democracy has, but it could be amplified by social media, and it could be further amplified with AI. So yeah, how do we? And so I think that's what's making it difficult to legislate and regulate properly, because there are conflicting interests at stake. If you're a corporation, you want the least possible barriers that are going to slow you down. I like the low tax suggestions very much.
But even on that,
but companies will fight against that because it will mean less revenue, right?
But even people might. Because
maybe I can just say,
yes, go for it.
Maybe I'll just say about the free speech issue that this is a smoke screen used by the big corporations. It's not a free speech issue because bots don't have free speech. Bots don't have rights. Humans have rights. We have the right to freedom of speech. So, to ban a human being from Twitter or to ban a human being from Facebook, that's a difficult issue. But to ban the bots from Facebook or Twitter, that's easy. I mean, they don't have rights. Who is going to defend the freedom of speech of bots?
Elon Musk, perhaps? I guess I wonder, and I completely understand the point around it being a smokescreen driven by corporate interests, but it has been convincing to certain subsects of various political ideologies, right? And how do you say to someone who is used to now having the ease of doing whatever they want on social media that actually you have to go to this building? And I mean, it sounds amazing. Wouldn't it be wonderful to know people you're talking to on social media are real people, but convincing them to do so? Like, what is the imperative?
Well,
how do we do that?
That's why we have the conversation we are having today. We need enough people to understand the risks, because losing democracy might be losing a lot of the well-being and freedoms and all of the good things that liberal democracies have brought. We might lose a lot of that with losing democracy. So we need people to understand that, and it's going to take time. It's going to take many discussions, but that's the way I can see. The threat of losing something dear to us is probably the best way to, bring us to make choices that, we feel bad, like going to this building to get our account approved.
There are other...
I don't have time.
Everyone will say that. Professor Harari, there are others out there making suggestions, more extreme suggestions about how to counter the existential threat and the level to which there needs to be government intervention, even going so far as to suggest some sort of world government. And the reason I ask you about that is because I think the same people who will be upset about any infringement as they view it on free speech will also go right to that example to say why government shouldn't intervene. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, world government is a terrible idea. It's impractical, and even if it could be done, it shouldn't. There are also ideas about that we have to set up some kind of authoritarian or totalitarian system in order to prevent, to save humankind. But I think the only realistic way to save humankind is, first of all, to save democracy, because totalitarian systems will be much, much worse than democracies when it comes to regulating AI and keeping it under control. The traditional problem of totalitarian regimes is that they tend to believe in their own infallibility, that they never make mistakes, and they don't have any strong self-correcting mechanisms for identifying and correcting their own mistakes. And with a totalitarian regime or some kind of super powerful world government, the temptation of that system to give too much power to an AI and then not be able to regulate it, it will be almost irresistible. And once a totalitarian regime gives power to an AI, there will not be any self-correcting mechanism that can point out the mistakes that the system will inevitably make and correct them. And it should be very clear that AI is not infallible. It has a lot of power, it can process a lot of information, but information isn't truth. And there is a long way leading from information to truth and to wisdom. And if we give too much power to an AI, it is bound to make mistakes. Only democracies have this kind of checks and balances that allow them to try something, and if it doesn't work, to identify the mistake and correct it.
Why do you think, Professor Bengio, there are people making suggestions that go that far, and what is your assessment of them?
Well, it is a simple idea that if we all were some kind of camera that watches everything we do, and some central government using AI would check that we don't do something really dangerous for humanity, like sending the command to kill everyone or just the bad guys or whatever, we would be safer. It's an appealing idea if you forget about everything that Yuval has been telling us. But on the surface, it says, oh, well, okay, so how do we make sure that no one on Earth, knowing the recipe for getting an AI into this stage where it could be dangerous for humanity would actually execute the bad command. Like, let's say we all had access to that knowledge. How do we make sure that no one will do it? So I think I don't think it's the right solution, but it's understandable. You would say, well, let's make sure everyone doesn't do it because they are wired up, watched, and they are controlled, and they can't do. Their freedom is restricted in very strong ways. It might be a tempting scenario, but I think it's very dangerous, as Yuval has been explaining. And I would like us instead to think through what are our options. Like, are there other ways that we could organize society so that it would be safe in the sense of safe AI, and that we preserve our human values, human rights, human dignity, and democracy? It's a difficult one, but I think it's worth spending our best brains time on these kinds of questions.
What does your intuition tell you, if I could follow up with you, Professor Bengio, on whether that win-win-win scenario exists?
Well, I would say it would be difficult, especially if we don't have enough time. But when you get discouraged about something that seems so much bigger than your own little, human person, you have to remember that we can only do our best. And so I think our moral duty, even if the odds seem, bad, is to try, is to think through this. So think about people who have been fighting for years, decades, for us to change our ways to deal with climate change. Mm-hmm. It may seem like a desperate cause, or at least it has for many years, and hopefully it's getting better. But people continue fighting, right? Continue trying. And that's what we have to do with the challenge of AI. And it's worth it because we might bring good health to everyone, education, solve climate change, and we might even be able to reform society completely in ways that maybe you would call utopia, but might give us all of these good things, and even better than the current kind of society we have in terms of democracy and well-being of people.
Do you see, Professor Harari, a reason for optimism in the same vein? Do you feel that the worst case scenario is avoidable?
Wait, I didn't say that I was optimist. I said we have...
I characterize it as such.
I said that I don't want to be either optimist or pessimist. I said that we have a duty, a moral duty to go for the optimist solution and try to make it happen.
And so I'm asking based on that, do you think that is possible, Professor Harari?
Yeah, I think basically we created the problem. We still have the power to solve it. Not for many years, because the AI will take power away from us, but at present we still have the power. And maybe one more general thought about what we just heard is, about intelligence and all this talk about intelligence being such a good thing. We are the most intelligent beings on Earth so far. And look where our intelligence has brought us. That we are now discussing that because of the things that we invent, we are now discussing these scenarios, like putting a camera on every person and destroying human freedom and human privacy in order to protect us from something we invented with our intelligence, allegedly, in order to provide us with better healthcare and other stuff. I think one of the things about intelligence is that the most intelligent agents at the same time also tend to be the most stupid agents around. The frogs wouldn't do it, something like we just did. So also when we think about artificial intelligence, it's also probably going to be incredibly stupid in some of the things it does. It's not necessarily optimistic, but it's just to kind of frame the discussion about artificial intelligence and intelligence in general for a moment. And again, ultimately, the problem is us, not the AI. Like what we've just discussed is, for instance, the collapse of democracy, it's mostly bad human actors who are using AI in a malevolent way. So I think if we spend as much time on developing, on understanding, and developing our own minds as we spend on developing AI, we would be safe.
I completely agree, and I would go farther than that. I think it's the only way, if we want to, avoid the Big Brother totalitarian regime that we talked about. The only way to converge to something that would preserve our values is by changing humans. And I think it is possible. So there are subsets of humans that are more ethical, wiser, better understand themselves, more compassionate, more rational. So we know it is possible. How do we bring that to the whole of humanity? That's the utopia I was talking about.
Do you, just to follow up on that, as you describe that, I think of a lot of people who maybe have just seen the headlines about AI and who hear that and think that this is just a way to completely reorient or change society, and they get scared off by that. Is there a risk to talking about that as the solution and then alienating people who need to buy into whatever solution is actually implemented?
Yeah, and I understand people are close to me who are concerned that by focusing the discussion on these catastrophic risks to democracy or humanity, we are not focusing on the current issues with society, the current issues with AI, with bias and discrimination, for example, and the injustices that exist. So we need to do all of those things at the same time. But maybe there's a convergence of the solutions.
Professor Harari, what are your thoughts on how to navigate getting buy-in, both politically and among the public, to making sure we are committed as a society to trying to solve the issue?
And first of all, we need to focus society's attention on these problems. It's not in order, it's not alarmist. It's not in order to hide from us other problems. But it's really, again, aside from the long-term existential risk, many of our most immediate problems in the economy, in society, can get much, much worse because of AI. We didn't talk much about the job market, but this should be a very central concern for everybody. And I don't think that AI will destroy all jobs. It will destroy some jobs. It will create a lot of new jobs. But the transition, again, retraining people, this will be very difficult. Again, remember that Hitler rose to power because of 3 years of something like 25% unemployment in Germany. So even if in 20 years it will be okay, we don't have 20 years. What do you do with 20% unemployment for 3-4 years? And with regard to politics, I think there is also a deficiency of people within the political system with a very deep understanding of the technology and its impact. Because most of the people who understand the technology, they want to be the next Zuckerberg or the next Elon Musk. They don't go to politics in order to raise the awareness of the public and regulate it. They go to business to make billions. We have some few exceptions. For instance, Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister of Taiwan, she was a hacker, and she could have went the business way to have a startup and make billions, and she decided, no, I will go to politics and I will help the public and the political system understand and regulate this explosive potential. So we basically need fewer Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks and more Audrey Tangs.
That's definitely one way to put it. I wanted to pick up Professor Bengio on a point that Professor Harari made around jobs, because I do think the discussion around what AI means for my job, for your job, for the audience's jobs, is a very tangible way to ground the threat it poses, just like with the existential threat climate change poses. Looking at the floods in Quebec, the fires in Alberta, certainly grounds it for us, and ultimately, I think, changes the impetus for politicians to act. How would you characterize the threat or lack thereof AI poses to our jobs?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I've tried to read a little bit on this, and I see that the various camps, as usual in economy, make very different claims. So on the one hand, there are people who are like, for example, there was a recent study coming out of OpenAI and academics suggesting a large fraction of the jobs would be, say, modified, and you get a lot more productivity, which means we would either have less people doing those jobs, or we would do more of those things. So think about programming is a good example. If we could do our programming job twice as fast because of AI tools, are we going to have half as many programmers, or are we going to have the same number doing twice as much good? So that's it's hard to predict those things. And also, one of the arguments I've heard on the side of let's not worry is societies change slowly, and even if we had the technology for something, it might take years or sometimes decades for people to really bring it in society and have a big impact on the job market. Now, okay, there are also the other arguments that are saying AI is different. Once you have a system that essentially does their work better, so think about right now, we're talking about all the jobs that you can do by just manipulating language. Like you just, email and social media and so on, and working with databases and stuff. It's likely that those kinds of jobs could be done better fairly quickly in many sectors, and whether companies are going to be able to do this quickly or not is really hard to predict. But if they do, we could really have these transition problems that Yuval's talking about.
Do you think, Professor Harari, that the jobs part of the discussion is a way to ground this for people who are maybe agnostic at this point?
Absolutely, because this makes it very, very clear. What if a bot or an AI is coming from my job? Mm-hmm. This grabs people's attention immediately. And again, it's not a simplistic idea that there will be no longer any jobs for humans. There will be a lot of new jobs, but the transition is difficult. How do you retrain people? Especially if you need to take into account the global considerations. Because the AI revolution is being led by a very small number of countries who are likely to become extremely rich and powerful because of that, whereas it could destroy the economy of less developed countries. Even if you think about something, like textile industry, what happens to the economy of Honduras or Bangladesh if it becomes cheaper to produce textiles in Canada and the US than in Honduras and Guatemala and Bangladesh? So do you really think you'll be able to retrain millions of textile workers in these countries to be, designer of virtual reality games? And who will pay for the retraining? I mean, in the advanced, developed countries, the gains from the AI revolution will enable the government, hopefully, to cushion the blow for the people who would lose their jobs and will enable them to retrain. But I don't see a US government levying taxes on Google and Facebook and Microsoft and sending the money to Honduras or to Bangladesh to help the people there retrain and cope. So we could see a kind of new, like with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, that led to very few countries basically conquering and dominating the whole world, this could happen again within a very short time due to the automation revolution and the AI revolution. And again, if you add to that, it's not just the economy, it's also the type of political control that you can get from harvesting all the world's data and analyzing it. Previously, to control a country, you needed to send in the soldiers. Now, increasingly, you just need to take out the data. What happens to a small country somewhere when the entire personal records, medical records, whatever, of every politician and journalist and judge and military officer is held by somebody in Silicon Valley or in China? Is it still an independent country, or did it become a kind of data colony? So these are the kind of immediate dangers that I think should be clear to any citizen, no matter what their views are on the long-term existential risks of AI.
Well, on that's probably a perfect note to finish our discussion, because I think we are all a lot more clear after this discussion on exactly what you just laid out, what both of you have laid out. I can't thank you both enough for all the information you provided us with today. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure, and I do feel like instead of crying ourselves to sleep, we're armed with a bit more knowledge now, so that's a good thing. Thank you all very much for your attention today. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.